of miracles, the philosopher David Hume states that a miracle is a transgression of the laws of nature. And in my current work, I'm interested in that point where we get beyond technology and we have to resort to the metaphysical and miraculous. So all of this work began with the idea of a hoax. So I had been doing radio hoaxes where I would jump onto commercial frequencies and play my own programming. But in the US, we have organizations like the FCC who frown upon that type of behavior. And so it was an art project that really didn't have much longevity. So I looked at the idea of hoax and found out that it came from hocus pocus, which in turn comes from a line in the Catholic Eucharist where the priest says, hoc est enim corpus meum. And it's the point at which he transforms the bread into the body of Christ. And the whole thing is known as transubstantiation, and it's where the appearance of a thing remains the same and its reality changes. So the tree of 40 fruit is a single tree that grows 40 different varieties of stone fruit, including peaches, plums, apricots, nectarines, cherries, and almonds. Throughout the majority of the year, it's a normal-looking stone fruit tree until spring when it blossoms in variegated tones of pink and white and crimson. And then in summer when it grows all of those different types of fruit. I started this project as an artwork, purely for aesthetic reasons. What I wanted to do was place it in these public settings and have people happen upon it and see these different colored blossoms and see this different fruit. But as the project has continued to evolve, it's become a research project and a form of conservation. So I start the tree of 40 fruit through the process of grafting. I take a short section of a plum tree, graft it to a root structure. I grow it for 3 to 5 years until I prune it and develop 4 to 5 scaffolding branches. For those of you that don't know, almost all fruit trees are grafted. If you took the seed from a fruit, plant it, it produces a genetic variant of the parent. It's an adaptability and a survival adaptation of the plant. So it's going to taste different than the parent tree that it came from. And also, grafting dates back at least 3,000 years. To give you an idea, I don't know if you have Macintosh apples here, but all Macintosh apples, so this is pretty well known in the United States, they all came from one single tree that's been grafted over and over and over and creating thousands of orchards. So the process I use for grafting is called budding, and what I do is I'll go out and I'll collect all of these different varieties that I want to graft onto the parent tree. This usually takes place in August. I take a small sliver of the branch that includes the growth bud, insert it into a like-size incision into the parent tree, tape it, let it sit, and I prune it back the following spring. The tree gets confused and thinks it's its own growth bud, and it'll start to grow a new branch. I'll typically graft 4 or 5 of these different buds onto one of those scaffolding branches so that way I can grow the trees exponentially. The first problem I faced with doing this project is that I could not find 40 different varieties of stone fruit. And this is despite the fact that I live in New York State, which 100 years ago was one of the leading producers of fruits in the US. And it was at this point I was introduced to monocultures. Eventually, I did find a research university that had this small orchard tucked away of these heirloom and antique fruits. So these are fruits that date back centuries, some even a millennia. What I was able to do is I picked up the lease on that orchard, and I was able to then graft all the varieties onto the trees within my nursery. So the tree of 40 fruit, when they start, I'll grow them from anywhere from 3 to 5 years in my nursery, and at that point, I'll site them. And so this is what they look like when they're sited, and then this is what they look like about 3 or 4 years after planting. So with the trees, what I realized what I could do is they essentially collapse space, right? I can go and I can take an entire orchard and collapse it onto one tree through the process of grafting. And through that, what I've begun to do is that I've started to look at the trees as almost the agricultural history of an area. I'll find varieties that were historically grown in the region and graft them onto the tree. And so this is what the blossom looks like. And so in summer, this is what the tree looks like. It's a normal looking fruit tree. The number 40 becomes significant to this. I started off with like grand aspirations. I was going to do like a tree of 100 fruit, but that was rather arbitrary. And then number 40, I eventually decided on that because it's found throughout Western religion. It's this number that's not a dozen, and it's not infinite, but it's beyond counting, and it's a multitude. So each of the trees has a diagram, and what I realized early on by watching the growth habits of the trees and by documenting it, I found that each variety has its own type of blossom, and it has its own time that it blossoms in. So I can essentially shape or sculpt how that tree blossoms and how it fruits. And so this is what that looks like. And so these are plums taken from 1 week from one tree of 40 fruit in 1 week in August, okay? So there are in fact thousands upon thousands of different types of plums and peaches and apricots, but we only have access to 2 or 3 varieties. And the reason for that is really the industrialization of agriculture, okay? So there's 2 or 3 varieties that are grown, and how fruit is grown is really astonishing. It is not grown for its taste, it's not grown for its nutritional value, it is grown for how well it ships and what color it is for the display at the market. To give you an idea of the extent to the industrialization of agriculture, as I've been walking the streets in Amsterdam, I've been looking, the cherries and apricots are showing up at the markets, and those are actually grown in California, despite the fact that you have the climate here in order to grow those same types of fruit. So through the project, I've been able to preserve 200 to 300 of these heirloom and antique varieties. And I realized the limitation of the Tree of 40 Fruit project was that it only preserves the varieties. I've been told by a few people that there's varieties that I'm currently growing that no longer exist. And I've been also told that I have the largest collection of stone fruits in the eastern part of the United States, which is something that you don't necessarily aspire to as a child. You're not like growing up going, I'm going to be the plum guy. But that's where we find ourselves now. And I realized that I need to reintroduce these varieties. So I came, actually I'll go back. A couple years ago I was invited by DARPA, which is part of the Department of Defense in the US, to come and speak to them. And when I was a little nervous. I thought, is this about the hoax thing? But they wanted to talk to me about food security. So the fact that we only grow 2 or 3 different varieties of fruits and vegetables poses a national security threat. And DARPA offered to help with planning these orchards, or trying to help. The only catch was that it had to have a technological component. And I was very wary about working with them from the beginning, but ultimately it became pretty apparent that there isn't a technological solution for this, that the change that needs to take place is actually more fundamental than that. And so it led to the idea of a Strijobstvisa. So I came across this term for a meadow orchard. And so I've been spending the past couple years designing and planning orchards. And part of that research involves actually observing growth habits of the trees, but it also involves pouring through old agricultural reports from the past couple hundred years. And I've been creating this sort of ancestry of these different varieties of fruit. Eventually, I plan to have the orchard serve as a resource to make them accessible to individuals and growers so that they can come, collect their own varieties of stone fruit, test them out, learn how to graft, and if they want to, create their own Tree of 40 Fruit, go from there. In addition to that, and I guess it's coming from going through all of those old agricultural reports, I've been creating my own album of pomology. So I'm creating a series of prints based on those 19th century drawings of fruit, which will also include the information collected from the field guide, and it'll be a sort of accompaniment with the orchard. The other thing, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, the idea of doing a recipe book, which I don't know. As I've been doing research, I've been coming across these centuries-old recipes for these stone fruit. And some of the fruit were bred specifically for certain recipes. So I see that as sort of being the extension of the tree of 40 fruit eventually. Okay, so if you've ever tried to grow anything, you have an understanding of metaphysics. There's a certain point at which, like, you've done everything that you can in terms of trying to grow this thing, and then hope and faith starts to take over. I grew up on a small farm, and my mother just recently told me of this story of my grandfather, where he was a very stoic person, atheist, and during the middle of the drought, she walked by his bedroom and saw him kneeling by the side of his bed, crying and praying. And it was this idea that he had done everything he could, and it was up to chance. And it led me to start to think about, how do we attempt to resolve the impossible, the miraculous? And so I guess the other thing that's important to tell you is that in the past 5 years that I've been growing fruit, 2 of those years I haven't gotten any fruit. It's because the fruit was killed off due to erratic weather as a result of climate change, and which also contributed to this idea of looking at weather modification, the idea of changing the weather. So this first piece is actually based on Norse mythology. There's this ritual that was done when sailors would leave. Witches would sew these bags of wind, and they would send them with the sailors so that if they were becalmed, they would cut open the bag, and it would release this air that would take them to shore. The title of this piece is called Acadia, and for the piece, what I did is I went and I compressed 20,000 cubic feet of air from Acadia National Park, which was known as Eden, Maine. And I moved it 500 miles southwest to New York, and I inflated these 10-foot weather balloons and filled this museum sculpture courtyard. And so from the bottom it looks like this, and from the top it starts to emulate a cloud. And the idea with it is that over the course of the exhibition, it diffuses and changes the atmosphere of the museum. And it really worked for little kids who would pop them on school trips. That was actually probably one of the best things to watch. So the other forms that the project is now taking is trying to convince a city, small or large city, to let me ring all of their church bells as a storm approaches. So to this day in France, what's still done is that as a storm will approach the vineyards, they'll ring the church bells. And it's believed that sound will make it hail before the storm actually hits the crops. And this actually was an extension of the Napoleonic Wars when they were the first great cannon battles, and they realized that sound would actually make it rain. So during those battles. And sort of the same, sort of as an extension of that, is the unorchestra, where I'm unorchestrating a cloud. But probably the most practical of my weather modification is the Hole in the Sky project. So about 10 years ago, these images started to appear on the internet, and everybody speculated that they were UFOs, but I kind of doubted that. And so I started to do some research and found that they were occurring 30 to 60 miles away from an airport. And they were also occurring within very specific cloud formations. So I created this hypothesis that they were being caused by the negative pressure off the wind foil. And so what I do now is that I sort of search for days where there's altocumulus clouds. They're also known as mackerel skies. They're thin layers of clouds composed of supercooled water droplets held at negative 20 degrees. The reason they haven't fallen out as rain is that they haven't nucleated yet. And so what I do is I read these weather charts, and this is where we'll start to get into weather balloons. This is kind of interesting fact. So every day, twice a day, there's 11,000 weather balloons launched from different sites globally. And based on that, they measure the temperature, the humidity, and the wind direction. That's where all forecasts come from. So what I'll do is I will, on days when I have the altocumulus clouds, I'll call up my pilot. We jump in a plane, we fly around, and we put holes in clouds. And so As you can imagine, like, having a pilot is not cheap. It's actually really expensive, and it's been difficult to control the time of day when I do these. So recently I've adapted it to using a weather balloon. So I'll launch the weather balloon. It has a payload that releases dust particles into the cloud. And my ultimate goal is to create these crepuscular rays, also known as Jacob's ladder or Buddha's fingers. In terms of the climate, I mean, through the Tree of 40 Fruit project, through the orchards, and with this project specifically, what I found is that I'm getting more in tune to the weather, and it starts to change more radically. And unfortunately, as we keep and constantly pass these points of no return when it comes to the climate, I think in a lot of ways we're going to be like my grandfather, where we are going to need to resort to the metaphysical and miraculous to make the fundamental change we need in the world. So thank you.